So a few words about Dr. Peck. Had the pleasure of learning more about him as I've done a little research in preparation for today. Dr. Peck joined the Meridian International Center as a program officer in 1984, becoming a senior program officer in 2000, then retiring in 2004 and returning again in March as in 2005 as a seasonal program officer. He taught in University of Chattanooga and University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and has been a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Among many other accomplishments, he has served as an Arabian Peninsula Affairs Analyst at the US Department of State in 1981 to 1983, and has written on Persian, Arabian Gulf, and Arabian Peninsula issues in chapters, contributed to 9 books and in a number of articles. And I understand there's yet another publication coming out soon. He has an AB and AM from Harvard University, and an MA in Law and Diplomacy, and a doctorate from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And he speaks a number of languages as well, including some French, Arabic, German, Spanish, and Tagalog. Amazing. So we are so glad to have you here with us, Malcolm. And let me pass the floor to you to take it away.
Thank you very much, Katerina, for that kind and perhaps slightly exaggerated introduction. But I appreciate your flattering words. If someone suggests that in today's world, filled as it is with violence and conflict, that compassion can be the most compelling force in society, that would seem to be a rather foolhardy attempt. But I'm going to make that attempt today in the next few minutes, because I do believe that compassion ultimately can triumph in shaping the way that we live with one another. It starts, of course, at the very personal level. And I go back not quite 4 years to the time when I lost my own wife, Ida, whom many of you remember. I remain deeply grateful to the many people who showed kindness and generosity at that very difficult time, members of my family, friends, and a wonderful nonprofit organization in this area called Capital Caring, which provides services to those who are in grief over the loss of loved ones. It happened that about 6 months after my loss of Ida, a Filipino friend of ours lost her husband, to whom she had been married for almost exactly the same 46 years that I had been married to Ida. She was having great difficulty with her grief, and mutual friends suggested that perhaps I had learned something from my own experience that I could contribute to helping her. I did so, and to my great satisfaction, found that I was able to give her real assistance in navigating the shoals of grief. To this day, 3 years later, she frequently remarks how grateful she was that I was able to give her that support. The same thing happened with Beth, who 2 years ago lost her Warren, her partner of 10 years, to COVID. And I rushed over to her house with the same books that had helped Sita and me to navigate our grief. And in our shared sorrow, the two of us have come, as some of you know, to be a loving couple. And finally, my neighbor Helen, known to you, to many of you as the president of our church in 2020 and 2021, she had been a wonderful neighbor for 44 years, often rendering acts of kindness and generosity. And when it was no longer possible for her because of her advancing illness to look after herself, I persuaded her with some difficulty and with assistance from Rich to come over to my house where I could look after her with other people's assistance. Many people suggested that this was an enormous sacrifice on my part, but I have to say that I never regarded it in that way. For me, it was a blessing, an opportunity to give back to someone for whom I deeply cared in the last painful weeks of her life. So these deeply personal experiences led me to think a little bit more about human compassion and the kind of role that it can play in the larger community. I live in Lyon Park, which is a very pretty part of the leafy suburb of Arlington, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington. The neighborhood is closely knit. There are frequent meetings at which mutual needs are discussed. Particularly during the time of COVID, the members of the community came very closely together, looking after one another. Programs were provided for children who no longer were able to attend school, programs of both learning and entertainment. People looked after each other in a very special way. One Arlingtonian, a lady who describes herself as a kindness activist, has created a kindness yard sale that occurs once a year in Arlington. The proceeds are used for various programs which would be characterized as compassionate, and many of her neighbors have taken up the cause and created their own compassionate yard sales. Also, I happened to come across an article I started clipping about 2.5 years ago, clipping articles that I came across in the press that were indications of compassion and the role it plays in society. One that caught my attention was in Time magazine, which in 2021 nominated a Kid of the Year. He was an 11-year-old from Texas who identifies himself as an ambassador for kindness. This young man organized a donation of 100,000 meals for poor families at Thanksgiving and the provision of 500,000 books to children who would not otherwise be able to afford them. In the process of keeping my binder of clippings on acts of kindness around the world, I discovered something quite remarkable, and that was the fact that in the year 2020, which was the year of COVID, the year when COVID struck and was most damaging, in both the United States and the United Kingdom, that year was the most generous year for contributions to philanthropic causes. People gave more money during that difficult year than in any other year before. In addition, in this country, almost half of all Americans, almost 50% of all Americans regularly checked in on elderly or sick neighbors, and 20% of Americans put themselves in harm's way by knowingly exposing themselves to COVID to help others. Interestingly, in the 2020 presidential elections, one of the candidates, Joyce Williamson, surely for the first time in the history of presidential campaigns, made the need for compassion one of the principal planks in her platform. Another interesting example of the role that compassion may assume is the work of the neurologist James Doty at Stanford University. In the year 2008, he created a compassion center at Stanford, and 12 years later, there are compassion centers, collaborators working with him all around the world. And one sidelight that caught my attention was the fact that his personal memoir, which deals with the subject of compassion, has become a hit song in Korea. In Silicon Valley, an effort is ongoing to promote higher productivity through the adoption of values like civility and kindness, certainly at the heart of compassion. And of course, our own experience at Church of the Holy City testifies to the strong desire of today's young people to find compassionate communities to work in, communities that provide spiritual values beyond the values of simply making money. Finally, we see at the universal level, especially in the suffering country of Ukraine, an extraordinary example of outpouring of compassion. The people within Ukraine who have taken those who have lost their homes into their homes, and those many people in neighboring countries who have accepted Ukrainians in their millions. The many organizations like Doctors Without Borders, the International Rescue Committee, the World Vision, people are selflessly contributing to the welfare of Ukrainians. A volunteer Midwest American initiative is sending to Ukraine fully equipped ambulances to deal with the injured in war. And it seems remarkable to me that in just the first few weeks of the conflict, some 20,000 people from all around the world, most of them having no particular connection with Ukraine, went to that country to take up arms, to put their own lives on the line in order to defend the freedom of others. As the conservative commentator Michael Gerson has commented in observing such happenings, the ideal of humble altruism is the main source of our power in the world. Finally, there is something in our DNA that may give us hope that compassion will in the end prevail. Evolutionary biologists seem to be coming to the position of accepting that that Darwin was mistaken in suggesting that the survival of the fittest is what exemplifies evolution, that rather it is the survival of the friendliest, which is another way of saying the survival of the most compassionate. And this is, I think, well demonstrated in the fate of the early Christian community, which survived repression at the hands of the Roman Empire and other hardships, not only survived but flourished, and did so precisely because of the compassion that drew together the members of the Christian community and enabled them to survive in the face of all kinds of hardship. If it was possible for the Christians of that day to survive in that fashion, I believe that we can continue to do so today, marking, I would say, the triumph ultimately of compassion.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you so much for raising this important topic with us, and just to reflect on your words. I've interviewed a number of folks in this community, and I would say how many times I've heard the reflection on what you had done for Helen, what Rich had done, has really been imprinted on them as something that our community should be like, and that what church really as a whole should really be for the community, that demonstration of love and compassion for one another. So what you've done, not just in words, but in actions, has had tremendous impact on us as a community. And I hope that we can replicate in our society, in each of our individual roles. And I may just add one more invitation to you, that I remember this wonderful conversation that we had together, where you mentioned you collect clippings of acts of kindness. If you ever want to share any of these that we can repost in our newsletter or in social media. Perhaps we can open this new channel of communication and have alternative news that people can read every day at the same time that we have all this other onslaught of news coming through. So I would love to have you share that with me, and we can reshare it with the group.
Great idea.
And let me invite those here with us to provide any comments or feedback on what Malcolm had shared. Anything that comes to mind.